Extras. Once they met the old priest, whose name turned out to be GE7, he impressed upon the party the urgency of the situation, and gave them an objective, to meet with the Ginaron controller. But by leaving 7 to talk to him and to relay information back and forth through his telepathic link to Draven, they were able to ask the old priest questions even as they raced up the tunnels and bridges towards the mechanical room. On the way back down, after learning from the Dark Ancient about the portal at the core of the facility, they had lots of questions about that. They learned that Ginaron was one of 3 research facilities with such portals, but GE7 had been a mere assistant without the security clearance to know their locations. Had the portal experiment been successful, the Ytarrans would have formed a network for instantaneous transportation across their empire, an amazing boon for trade, as well as the obvious defensive military applications. But one disturbing thing they learned was that in the months since the Diluvians had arrived, Kua Commander had spent days alternately negotiating with and threatening GE7 through his force field, trying to convince him to grant access to the core. The old Warforged priest was wise and very patient, and even an idiot could have seen through the Paladin of Slaughter's transparent lies whenever he attempted to negotiate, while his threats remained toothless as long as the force wall was intact. But through Ginaron Commander's blustering, occasional bits of information could be gleaned or inferred, and it slowly became evident to GE7 that the leader of the Diluvian expedition was aware of the existence of some sort of teleportation device within Ginaron, and that was the true purpose of the incursion. It was the reason the evil paladin had kept his forces here so long, despite making very little progress. Some part of the Diluvian government was not only aware of the portal experiments, but was very intent on gaining access to them. If you were super observant, you may have noticed that the players make no comment about the awesome ice-based 3D imaging technique used by the controller. That wasn't cut out for time. They just had no reaction to it because that ability was in my notes for the session, but I kind of forgot to describe it when we actually played through that part. I was having to manage a ton of things, including how much information they could get from both the controller and from GE7 about history, the facility, the invading Diluvians, etc., and also Temple 1's sudden but inevitable betrayal. That part was extra hard because Little One immediately picked up on the change in behavior, even though I thought I had started out pretty subtle. I thought his initial questions would sound pretty in character for his faux C-3PO facade. There were many good things about the controller room encounter and the way it played out, but I am acutely aware that I screwed up the fighting part by making it nearly unwinnable. I had tried to design it so that it would definitely live long enough to activate the portal, but that if they focused their efforts they could possibly smash it before it could disable the manual override. In practice, what I had devised was a difficulty level more on par with a World of Warcraft dungeon boss. If this was a computer game and they could reset the dungeon and try again, they probably would have beat it on their second or third try. But realistically, it was too difficult to both learn the fight and to beat it on the first and only try. On the plus side, it had no real chance of a party wipe because it was immobile. Also, the Dark Ancient had no desire to stick around after accomplishing his objective anyway. At this point, the Dark Ancients were brand new, totally mysterious, and seemed to have insane godlike powers. In reality, they have really insane powers, but they also have certain limitations. They do make awesome bad guys, though, and they have their own shadowy little place in the setting's lore. Warforged in the present day are quite uncommon, but even though most of them awake from suspended animation with little or no memory from the ancient times, the modern Warforged community has somehow maintained legends of the Dark Ancients and their soul-stealing evil. For now, it's worth noting 2 things about the Dark Ancient they fought. One, when it left Temple 1's body, the Warforged was an empty shell until the Dark Ancient returned to it. After being taken over once, the Warforged mind was gone. And 2, the Dark Ancient was able to take over the controller, which was a true construct. So clearly they are not limited to only living constructs like the Warforged. In ancient times, the god Ytaru found a gnome-like people who were creative and full of energy. He revealed himself to them in all his glory and lived among them, and they soon began calling themselves Ytarrans and shaping their society in his image. Fascinated and inspired by the god's own works, they pushed the boundaries of magical knowledge ever onward, far surpassing the arcane knowledge of even the ageless Eladrin. One day, however, Ytaru and another god, Marduk, had a great argument. Marduk, the god of strength and heroism, believed these people were living in Ytaru's shadow, and as long as the god lived among them, they could never achieve their true potential. Like almost all arguments with Marduk, this one came to blows. Ytaru was no slouch when it came to fighting, always a believer that one must have the willpower to do what is needed and what is right, the will to survive. But afterwards, he came to look upon his so-called children in a new light. He realized that, in a sense, Marduk had been right, for the wrong reasons, but right nonetheless. Ytaru's influence was leading the Ytarrans astray. These people, who were so inspired by his example, had great and well-deserved pride in their own achievements, but they had never learned the dangers that come with such knowledge and pride, and Ytaru realized that if he did not soon leave them, the Ytarrans would become totally dependent on him. If they were ever to become great in their own right, he must leave, and the longer he stayed, the less chance they would have to temper their knowledge with wisdom before it was too late for them. So leave them he did, wishing them well, but warning them that knowledge without wisdom is folly. And Ytaru swore to himself never to interfere with a people in this way again. However, it was mere centuries later that the god missed living among mortals so much that he took mortal form himself, to live beneath the mountains of the Iron Sea among another race of proud and skilled craftspeople, and so it came to pass that he took the name Muradin. The conversation with the controller was tense for a variety of reasons, but also put out there a lot of good, concentrated exposition, both explicit and implicit. For example, when the Dark Ancient, still posing as Demir Servant Temple 1, asked about the last edict, the controller started off by naming the last surviving Ytarran, Isolas Turi, using his full title, including not only Prime Minister, but what sounded like every other ministerial title in the nation. To me, pondering this just a little bit conjures an image of a handful of sick and aging survivors, dividing up the remaining positions of their government in order to keep control of a massive, almost self-sustaining bureaucracy, which was by that point composed solely of Warforged. The edict itself, delivered on a man's deathbed, officially granted freedom to the Warforged, which may seem a little odd given that once he died, there would be no one telling him what to do. But actually, that was exactly his worry. Because while most Warforged have both free will and intelligence, many of them still had a servile, mechanistic, bureaucratic mindset. Isolas Turi was worried that too many of them would simply continue their duties, farming for and guarding a people who no longer existed. So he officially released them from their duties in the hope that many of them would find some kind of lives for themselves, some kind of purpose. And many of them did, though others did in fact simply continue working as they always had, because they knew no other life, filling warehouses with food, then building new warehouses to hold even more as the fruits of their labor rotted away uneaten. Back in Ginaron, there was also the not-so-subtle implication that other intelligent constructs, like the controller itself, do in fact have free will. It said that it chose to take the edict literally and to continue his duties, even though it seemed fairly clear that the intent of the last Ytarran was to free all the sentient beings his people had created, which made it even more poignant when its mind was eclipsed and erased by the will of the Dark Ancient. After the Ytarrans, the so-called children of Ytaru, had died, their god spent a number of years in somber contemplation. By then, Muradin was praised by the dwarves as the greatest of all craftsmen. He had shared the good times and the bad with them, fought and bled by their side, discovered and taught them how to mine and smelt adamantite, the hardest metal in all of the three planes. But now, with the Ytarrans having been slain by their own hubris, by the very traits he had inspired in them, he blamed himself for their loss. He had thought that, in mortal guise, with the limitations that came with a mortal life, he could avoid his previous mistakes, but now he feared that was not enough. And so he left the dwarfhold of Maghargrig, never to return. He departed the city with great honours, and many of the dwarfs, his friends, apprentices, and admirers, stood all evening long outside the gates of Adamant, watching as he disappeared on foot over the horizon. The god known as Ytaru, as Muradin, even as Infernus, never again took mortal form, nor did he craft another artifact.